I'm Andy Pretty, I'm the Artistic Director of Kinetika and of Beach for Dreams, and I really wanted to create a project which was a 500-mile walk along the East Coast to create a space to have a conversation over 35 days with communities about the current political, economic and environmental climate and see if we could find a way of imagining a different kind of future.
I'm John Offord, I'm part of the media production team here, and I volunteered to walk the entire 500 miles because it looks like such an amazing thing to do.
My name's Kevin Rushby, I'm a Guardian travel writer, and my job on this journey is to take the events of each day and somehow, very quickly, that same day, turn it into a story.
And I will be your guide along this 500-mile walk, along the coastal paths, estuaries and marshes from Lowestoft to Tilbury. We meet at the First Light Festival at Britain's most easterly point. 500 flags on Lowestoft Beach, one for every mile we will walk. They're set out in the shape of the coastline and each is decorated with designs sent in by the public. We're setting off from here to Southwold and the plan is to carry on for 500 miles through Suffolk and Essex, along the inlets, estuaries and beaches until we reach Tilbury.
Each one of these flags has been adopted by one person who lives locally, submitted a design and we've translated it into a silk which represents their dream. They're going to walk with us for their mile and we're going to have a conversation over 35 days about how we could live differently in the future, which would take care of the environment, care of this coast, care of the communities and care of ourselves.
Today it's 10 miles to Southwold and tomorrow we'll walk on towards Aldborough, destination Tilbury Fort, August the 1st.
I'm Science Director at CFAS and we're the government's ocean science agency based here in Lowestoft. It's great to be able to introduce scientific concepts and some of the sort of scientific and environmental challenges that our oceans face, not just in the UK but internationally as part of the project. We're in a fantastic part of the UK here in the east. We've got a massively growing offshore energy sector, particularly in relation to offshore wind, and that brings huge opportunities in terms of the economy but also in terms of the environment with our efforts to fight climate change.
Fiddler's Green is a place I've heard tell, where fishermen go if they don't go to hell.
I got involved quite early on in helping to promote the idea up here and obviously volunteered to do a mile. I've got Pakefield Cliffs, mile 4, so I'm going off to walk today and do my mile towards that.
Wrap me up in the oilskins and blankets, no more on the docks I'll be seen. Just tell me, old shipmates, I'm taking a trip, mates, and I'll see you someday in Fiddler's Green.
I booked up for a mile 56 down in Icon, walked a fantastic mile, sent my photos in, came to the First Light Festival, and then here are the flags, and it's just fantastic.
When I was a little girl, and so me mama told me, away, haul away, we'll haul away, Joe. Away, haul away, we'll haul away, Joe!
We're at Kessingland Ness on the first day of our marathon 500-mile walk from Lowestoft to Tilbury, a route that covers much of the Suffolk and Essex coastline. In my life so far, the east coast of England, south of the Humber, has rarely featured. Between Lowestoft and Tilbury, I'm utterly lost. My mental map is bare. When I bought the OS map for this walk, I was shocked to discover there were bird reserves, cliffs and woods. We are walking with different sets of people every day, people who love their stretch of coast for various reasons and have each adopted a mile of our route. Today we're also accompanied by several scientists from the CFAS Institute in Lowestoft. Julie tells me that the white foam that is mounded up on the foreshore is actually a natural phenomenon caused by algae, not pollution as I'd thought. Sophie talks about plankton and their effect on fish populations.
My big message, I would say, if there was no plankton in the sea, there wouldn't be any fish either. Plankton in particular have a very short lifespan, which means they're very sensitive. They react very quickly to all these changes in temperature, pollution, how we exploit the sea, whichever that is, fishing or wind farms, anything, mining. So I would say putting An economic value to what we lose rather than what we gain from exploitation would be a big step forward.
Climate change is a pretty continuous thing, and there's natural climate change and there's man-made. Our man-made now is going a little faster, essentially faster than we've seen before. So at the moment we're going to struggle to pick out, or at least predict, what's going to happen, because we've not seen it go that fast before. You don't exactly know when a big storm is going to arrive that might punch a hole through a barrier beach, for example. Well, a lot of this coastline is on very soft rock, so where the land is quite low level and flat, and it's also made of very loose sediment, such as the sands and the gravels that we see here. The land in Britain in general is just tipping because of where the ice used to be on the north. It's now gone, and over the course of several thousand years that's now rebounding. So this end of the country is just gradually lowering. So the combination of those things, plus the sea and the storminess and the gradually rising sea levels as well with the end of the ice age, just means this part of the coast is being eroded fairly continuously. So we've got, for most of Suffolk, a rough estimate, particularly as you go further south, about a metre a year that the land disappears. Here, where we're standing now, this isn't eroding at all. A lot of that sediment that's being eroded gathers in these places, such as this, nesses, and they tend to be stable.
On day 2 at Southwold, we're joined by artists and a group of students and carry the Pennants on a short ferry trip over the River Blythe. The days progress and we weave our way along the coastal path and through the fields and lanes of rural Suffolk. Further up the shingled coast stands an ugly concrete and rusting iron gantry that once marked the outfall where hot water from the Sizewell A reactor was pumped out to sea. When the reactor closed in 2006, the outfall had to be left in place because kittiwakes had adopted it as home and now nest all along its ledges. Sizewell looms over everything here. It looms over the vegetated shingle, a rare habitat only found in a handful of places around the world, a place of floral and insect abundance. And it looms over the human population, with plans to build new reactors. The old A and B reactors were constructed on the relatively firm foundation of a coralline crag outcrop, but the new one, C, will require the protection of a vast wall of concrete from the sea. One day, if built, its rusting hulk will be an island.
We're campaigning against building a nuclear power station here at Sizewell. My main concern is how close it is to the sea. The defences will need to be in place till 2190, that's 170 years from now, and this is an eroding coastline.
We reach Oldborough, home of Benjamin Britten. Artist Maggie Hambling's Scallop takes pride of place on the beach. And the art and culture theme continues as we pass Snape Maltings, Sutton Hoo, Flatford Mill and Grayson Perry's House for Essex.
We invited participants to go and take a walk on the nearest coastal lockdown mile and to take 2 photographs, one which was locating where that close-up was and the close-up. We then abstracted it into a line drawing like a block print. As we've come down during each day of the walk, we've had people meet us on their mile.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
You all right? Yeah.
Are you Diane's friend?
Yes. Yeah.
What's her name?
Gemma.
Hello, Gemma. I'm Ali. So you're mile 174?
Yes.
Just look, come and see if we can find your flag.
It's beautiful. They are all beautiful. We went down onto Earlham's, if you remember, and we saw the water crashing against the waves.
I just took a picture, printed it out and then traced it.
Many of them also wrote quite powerful pieces about why they chose that spot, what connects them to it.
The pandemic brought me here to this spot on mile 168 on the Beach of Dreams walk. Along this mile you'll find one of the oldest cinemas in the country, the Electric Palace, and that's the reason I'm here. I've never lived by the sea before. I had never been to Essex. On my birthday I decided to get away and get some perspective. Now I live in Harwich and I have my own set of keys to the little cinema on the harbour side. Thank you, Laura.
On the first day, Jamie and his daughters and his dad met us just at Cove Hythe, and Jamie read his piece, which included how he went down there as a young boy with his dad.
As a family, we've walked these paths for years. I have fond memories of exploring Benacre and neighbouring Cove Hythe as a child with my dad and sister, and now as a dad myself. We love and will continue to love it.
And his dad was right there and, hadn't realised that he was in the piece.
So hiya, my mile's mile 16. It starts here at the pier and ends over there at the lighthouse. And one of the things I like most about this mile is the beach huts and how everyone can show their individuality with the beach huts. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now we've come over the border into Essex. Tonight we're in Harwich, and this is part of the Harwich Festival that happens every year, and there's a number of other concerts and art exhibitions and trails around the town. We've got a lot of partnerships working with diverse communities in Essex and diverse artists. I went for a walk with Nabil on the beach at Walton-on-the-Naze, and we saw this really diverse set of materials on the beach. So he's incorporated the coast into his work. It's his response to the coastal erosion. The voice of those ancestors of the past, which is the warning to us about what might happen in the future.
At Walton on the Essex coast, a group of ragged people with empty staring eyes are standing just above the tide line, their feet tangled in seaweed. They have come ashore on the tip of the Naze Peninsula, a low finger of land where in 1720 a stone tower was built to warn mariners. They hold their tattered cloaks around themselves and seem to be waiting. Are they ghostly survivors of yet another village swallowed by the rising sea? Won't anyone help them?
9 miles out, you once had a Saxon village in Doggerland. The history is fascinating. A lot of the communities of the past have been lost to the sea, and it's hearing the echoes in the waves, and that's the symbolic conception of the work. This is one of the first sculptures I made on this project, the Sea People, and it's very skull-like, but it's a reflection of ourselves. Nothing is forever. And with this particular sculpture, I deliberately put it into the sea with the tide coming in, and when the tide went out, it left the seaweed naturally. With the actual twig from the tree that's recently fallen onto the beach further up the coast, I've actually used some of the branches. And you've got the shells that are on the sculpture and the rocks, and it's a reflection of who we are.
It is said the Sky People once were numerous, but they had drowned, and every dark hide of land and fire pit, each vale and fell had been seized by the rising flood. The swell of sea had beaten down defence. So they launched their boats, lashed and loaded auroch skin, and flexed the oars. Among the firs and flutes were sobbing infants.
Doggerland, in its heyday, you might say, was a continuous landmass. It emerged after the last ice age, about 19,000 years ago, and as the sea levels then were going down, more and more land was exposed until it was from Sweden over to Scotland and from Dover joining up with France on the other side. So you then create a landscape which is all estuary and lake and river and marsh, and like round here now when you go to the marshes that still survive, incredibly rich with life. And having brought the birds, the fishes, the land animals, you also then had the movement of humans coming over from France and colonising this whole area, so that there was a time when it was about the size of France, the entire Doggerland mass, and seems to have been the most populated area in all of Europe.
Loads of avocets and red shanks. Lovely. It's come out really nice. I come from a background of walking in mountains and coasts with cliffs and coves and sandy beaches. I'd never walked in Essex or Suffolk at all. Every day's something different and interesting. Like today around Mersey Island, I met a man who restores steam traction engines and all sorts. And visited a vineyard in Essex, and ate oysters. First ever oyster in England.
There we go, down in one.
Saw all the avocets down there, red shanks, and shell ducks, and just really butterflies, birds, beautiful. Each day I try and distill, I suppose, very quickly what I've heard and seen to make some sense of it. It's actually quite useful to do that because it kind of draws your attention to the patterns and shapes of the story. As a writer, I find that on the page when I write. And I remember things that perhaps I didn't notice at the time consciously. It's interesting to talk to people about how their lives have changed and what the future might hold, because I think it's going to be a very different place. It's pretty intense. We're up quite often at 6 or even earlier, and then we walk all day, every day. And we're over 2 weeks into it now, and you start to feel like the rhythm has come. I mean, I've never walked 500 miles before in a seamless expedition like this.
You've done the whole thing? Yeah.
This coast is really changing fast. I mean, we've seen things that are quite astonishing. I've seen the cliff falling away in front of me one day. Lots of big trees in the sea. Lots of debris on the beach of buildings. The sea is rising and ripping out the coast and changing it constantly. Here on Mersey Island, we saw a big bite out of the sea where the seawall was breached a couple of years ago. You know, it's taken a lot of farmland out. So you see all these challenges and you wonder what's going to happen. You know, what are people going to do? I feel there's a battle going on for the coast in that some people are like carving off little bits and calling it their private beach. And it seems so petty to be worrying about your little private piece of shingle when it probably ain't going to be there in 20 years' time anyway. And there are so much bigger things to worry about than whether you have it to yourself or not. And incidentally, we're walking along, we have it to ourselves most of the time anyway.
The flags that the walkers carry flutter like water, and Ali explains what they were made from. 5 natural dyes, indigo, madder, elderberry, tansy and poplar, on Murshidabad silk. I already know the tale of the silk as I was there in 2017 when Ali made one of several visits to the silk weavers around Murshidabad, part of West Bengal in India. They were losing a hopeless battle against Chinese imports and desperate for ideas. She suggested they stop heading down market and return to their traditions of pure, high-quality silk. It was a long and sometimes painful process, but this superior silk eventually turned up in Purfleet on the banks of the Thames and was made into these flags. It's only 200 metres, she admits, but it's a start. Every mile of our walk now has a different flag designed by people with a connection to that section of the 500 miles.
What I wanted to do was combine my own sort of skill and love of silk painting with walking, and so it evolved really from my first walking project in Wiltshire, walking Wiltshire's White Horses, when we moved to Thurrock, and we were invited to run a walking festival there. We worked with 10 schools and community groups to draw the places that they wanted us to walk, and from that we mapped the walk. And really, I suppose it took off when we did Silk River, which was a project that connected 10 communities along the River Thames with 10 communities along the River Hooghly in West Bengal. Since that time, we've stopped using the Chinese silk and transferred to the silk production from this little village called Islampur in West Bengal. It's part of our ethos to create a legacy from the work that we do, and so every time we get a silk commission now, I feel really excited because I know the weavers get another few metres of silk to weave.
We wanted to choose colours that actually fitted in with the colour of the sand and the colour of the grass and the colour of the sea, and that's why they leave beige and greens and greys in amongst the palette. And there was an initial sample dyeing day where they made up 50 of the flags, and we dyed those in March, and then all the rest of the 450 flags, that was done the first week in May. I was hands-on going through everything with people then. When you're dyeing them, you don't see them without the wax in, so you don't get the contrast really between the white of where the wax was on the original silk. Like, incredible to be involved in something and then see it actually out in public. It's very exciting.
A lot of the dye needs heating up. We dyed in giant tea urns. Who knew you could use tea urns to do natural dyeing? So that was really a huge, huge learning experience. Once the pictures were in, my main task was the practical cutting the silk to the right shape. because 500 triangles of silk are quite tricky. Usually if a rectangle of silk, you can rip and tear and get a nice rectangle, but you can't do that on the diagonal. So I spent a lot of time just cutting silk into long triangles and then sorting them out so that the artist could wax on the big silk.
The journey south continues, past Jaywick, through holiday resorts and fishing villages, and past mudflats and marshes of Dickensian proportions. It seems we're never far from a World War II or a Cold War relic, a keep-out sign or a power station. Now the heat is really coming up and there's no shade to be had. Out in the estuary, a dozen Thames barges sail past. And then finally, after 20 long miles, we reach our destination, the campsite at the Athona community, where the sky seems to excel itself, stretching out to its maximum, pushing the horizon far back. Bradwell Nuclear Power Station was built in 1969 and is now decommissioned, looking like an installation by the Bulgarian artist Christo, who wrapped up buildings like the Reichstag. But people don't come here to look at the power station. They're sailing their barges out in the estuary using old-fashioned wind power. Here at Bradwell, there are plans to cover most of the land between the marina and the historic St. Peter's Chapel with an updated nuclear facility. There is strong local opposition.
The plans are for a double reactor power station. The construction site at the moment, the developers are saying that it's going to be about 589 football pitches. The government's own appraisals of the site is it's the least suitable out of all the 8 nominated nuclear plant sites.
We walk around the skirts of the power station, which is a beach of cockle shells, an absolute gem where I discover the dried up skeleton of a pipefish, something like a seahorse with a snake-like tail.
It looks like a seahorse, but it might be a pipefish.
I've never seen such a creature in British waters.
On the coast of Essex, there's still a lot of quite difficult to get to places. I remember the first time I came to Athona, the community that we're sitting next to, probably about 20 years ago, and I drove out here. It was a winter's day. Rain was driving horizontally across the field. In the last mile you have this long straight road and the windscreen wipers could hardly keep the rain from down. And I thought I was driving to the end of the world. On many occasions when you are literally completely on your own with the enormous sky above you and a big seascape in front of you and nobody around. After the First World War, a lot of poor people in East London managed to get enough money to buy a small plot in rather rough, cheap agricultural land. We lived on Canvey Island and we lived in one of these little clapboard bungalows raised on brick piers. Essex, with this enormous long coastline and a lot of it inaccessible, it made it a place where social reformers like the Salvation Army would try and set up land colonies, different ways of giving the poor, ill-fed people of the East End a new start in life. Canvey Island was very much a number of social reformers, feminists, teetotal groups, set up hotels on Canvey Island to provide cheap holidays for the East End poor. I think there's a social conscience in the landscape in Essex that is slowly in the process of being kind of disclosed.
On the southern aspect of the bend of the Blackwater estuary, where it flows into the North Sea, lies St. Peter's Chapel, on the site of the former Roman fort of Athona, and adjacent to the modern Christian settlement of the same name.
As we leave Athona, we head into the longest stretch of walk without any human habitation. And then we're on to more marshes, mudflats, swamps and islands as we pass the quays, jetties and boats along the coast and rivers of Essex. Today we are circumambulating Canvey Island. In Edwardian times, a character called Hester arrived and decided to make it a new world, a utopia. He promised a monorail run on electricity, winter gardens and beautiful Scandinavian-style houses. None of it materialised, but people came and some stayed. They built cabins and eked out a living. Canvey, or the island as its inhabitants know it, began to develop something of a mystique. But in 1953, the dream took a bad knock. Floods ripped across the island and 59 people died here.
The 1953 floods were the largest environmental disaster in Britain for over 250 years. People died when the floods hit Canvey Island. 1,100 people died in the Netherlands that night. It was a unique weather event, 31st of January 1953, and a surge tide coming down the North Sea, excess rainfall, winds all going in the wrong way. One very early sign that everything was going wrong happened along here when a policeman walking along the sea wall wondered why the tide wasn't going out. Like nature has kind of gone into reverse. And it didn't go out. It just came back again. And 35 people died at Jaywick that night. Not only from the water coming over the sea wall, but they were trapped from behind because the water came up the Colne River towards Colchester and then flooded the fields and the land behind Jaywick. They were surrounded and trapped. It covered Canvey Island completely, and most of the people who died had managed to break through the roof and sit on the roof, but they died of exposure.
At Southend, things change. The artists are now on home territory, and we're joined by a large group of walkers. The pace slackens, and the path circles across the hills and marshes of the Thames estuary. We are joined by guides and historians along the way, as we head towards the last few miles of the full 500, from Grays to Tilbury. The last day's march is something of a procession, 5 miles through Tilbury to the fort. Physically, this has been harder than I expected. To get up every day, walk around 15 to 20 miles, write a blog and go to bed. There have been low days, soaking wet and shivering, cursing the English summer that seems to have thrown 4 seasons at us, sometimes all within 24 hours. But for me, walking all day to find material that will be woven into a narrative has never been a burden. Always a pleasure. And here at the end of 500 miles, with the local community celebrating, I don't think I'll remember the low points. Instead, what will stick in the mind is the pleasure of stretching your legs on long grassy paths by the sea, the crunch of shingle and the sounds of birds.
It's been absolutely amazing the last 35 days, walking 500 miles with Kevin Rushby and John Offord. This is the Beach of Dreams.